Good evening and welcome back to Cecilia. I really hope that you enjoyed and found interesting and a new perspective if you listened to my update yesterday. I'm quite tempted to come back and read more of that text, but I feel like I can't do two things at once, so we're back to Cecilia for now. And quite a brief update today because I got sidetracked by looking ahead in this brick of a book and discovering there are entire plot points, plot arcs, development, major events to characters that I have completely forgotten about. I was reading on quite a bit later. I was just like, what? This is a thing that happens? Oh my god! So prepare for this to get super dramatic. But maybe not in the next chapter. Anyway, Book 4, Chapter 1, A Complaint. As Cecilia now found herself cleared, at least, of all suspicions of harbouring too tender a regard for Mr. Belfield, her objections to visiting his sister were removed, and the morning after her return to Mr. Harrel's, she went in a chair to Swallow Street. She sent her servant upstairs to inquire if she might be admitted, and was immediately taken into the room where she had twice before been received. In a few minutes Miss Belfield, softly opening and shutting the door of the next apartment, made her appearance. She looked thin and pale, but much gratified by the sight of Cecilia. "Ah, madam," she cried, "you are good indeed not to forget us, and you can little think how it cheers and consoles me that such a lady as you can condescend to be kind to me. It is quite the only pleasure that I have now in the whole world." "I grieve that you have no greater," cried Cecilia. "You seem much fatigued and harassed. How is your brother? I fear you neglect your own health by too much attention to his." "No, indeed, madam. My mother does everything for him herself, and hardly suffers anybody else to go near him." "What then makes you so melancholy?" said Cecilia, taking her hand. "You do not look well. Your anxiety, I am sure, is too much for your strength." "How should I look well, madam?" answered she, "living as I live? However, I will not talk of myself, but of my brother. Oh, he is so ill! Indeed, I am sadly, sadly afraid he will never be well again." "What does his surgeon say? You are too tender and too much frightened to be any judge." "It is not that I think myself he will die of his wound, for Mr. Rupil says the wound is almost nothing, but he is in a constant fever, and so thin and so weak, that indeed it is almost impossible he should recover." "You are too apprehensive," said Cecilia. "You know not what effect the country air may have upon him. There are many, many expedients that with so young a man may yet be successful." "Oh no, the country air can do nothing for him. For I will not deceive you, madam, for that would be doubly a fault wherein I am so ready in blaming other people for wearing false appearances. Besides, you are so good and gentle, that it quite composes me to talk with you. So I'll honestly speak the truth, and the whole truth at once. My poor brother is lost. Oh, I fear for ever lost, all by his own unhappy pride. He forgets his father was a tradesman. He is ashamed of all his family, and his whole desire is to live among the grandest people, as if he belonged to no other. And now that he can no longer do that, he takes the disappointment so to heart that he cannot get the better of it. And he told me this morning that he wished he was dead, for he did not know why he should live only to see his own ruin. But when he saw how I cried at his saying so, he was very sorry indeed, for he has always been the kindest brother in the world, when he has been away from the great folks who have spoilt him. But why, said he, Henrietta, why would you have me live, when instead of raising you and my poor mother into a higher station, I am sunk so low, that I only help to consume your own poor pittances to support me in my disgrace?" "I am sorry indeed," said Cecilia, "to find he has so deep a sense of the failure of his expectations. But how happens it that you are so much wiser? Young and inexperienced as you are, and early as you must have been accustomed from your mother as well as from Mr. Belfield to far other doctrine, the clearness of your judgment and the justness of your remarks astonish as much as they charm me." "Ah, madam, brought up as I have been brought up, there is little wonder I should see the danger of high education, let me be ever so ignorant of everything else. For I and all my sisters have been the sufferers the whole time, and while we were kept backward, that he might be brought forward, while we were denied comforts that he might have luxuries, how could we help seeing the evil of so much vanity, and wishing we had all been brought up according to our proper station? instead of living in continual inconvenience and having one part of a family struggling with distress, only to let another part of it appear in the way he had no right to." "How rationally," said Cecilia, "have you considered this subject? And how much do I honour you for the affection you retain for your brother, notwithstanding the wrongs you have suffered to promote his elevation." "Indeed he deserves it. Take but from him that one fault, pride, and I believe he has not another. And humoured and darling child as from his infancy he has always been, who at that can wonder or be angry? And has he still no plan, no scheme for his future destination?" "No, madam, none at all, and that makes him so miserable, and being so miserable makes him so ill. For Mr. Rupill says that what with such uneasiness upon his mind, he can never in his present low state get well. Oh, it is melancholy to see how he is altered, and how he has lost all his fine spirits, he that used to be the life of us all. And now he hardly ever speaks a word, or if he does, he says something so sorrowful that it cuts us to the soul. But yesterday, when my mother and I thought he was asleep, he lifted up his head and looked at us both with the tears in his eyes, which almost broke our hearts to see, and then in a low voice he said, 'What a lingering illness is this! Ah, my dear mother, you and poor Henrietta ought to wish it quicker over, for should I recover, my life hereafter will but linger like this illness.' And afterwards he called out, 'What on earth is to become of me? I shall never have health for the army, nor interest nor means. What am I to do? Subsist in the very prime of my life upon the bounty of a widowed mother, or with such an education, such connections as mine, enter at last into some mean and sordid business?' "It seems, then," said Cecilia, "he now wants less a physician than a friend." "He has a friend, madam, a noble friend, would he but accept his services. But he never sees them without suffering fresh vexation, and his fever increases after every visit he pays him." "Well," cried Cecilia, rising, "I find we shall not have an easy task to manage him. But keep up your spirits, and assure yourself he shall not be lost, if it be but possible to save him." She then, though with much fearfulness of offending, once more made an offer of her purse. Miss Belfield no longer started at the proposal, yet gratefully thanking her, said she was not in any immediate distress, and did not dare risk the displeasure of her brother, unless driven to it by severer necessity. Cecilia, however, drew from her a promise that she would apply to her in any sudden difficulty, and charged her never to think herself without a banker while her direction was known to her. She then bid her adieu, and returned home, meditating the whole way upon some plan of employment and advantage for Mr. Belfield, which by clearing his prospects might revive his spirits, and facilitate his recovery, for since his mind was so evidently the seat of his disease, she saw that unless she could do more for him, she had yet done nothing. Her meditation, however, turned to no account. She could suggest nothing, for she was ignorant what was eligible to suggest. The stations and employments of men she only knew by occasionally hearing that such were their professions, and such their situations in life, but with the means and gradations by which they arose to them she was wholly unacquainted. Mr. Monckton, her constant resource in all cases of difficulty, immediately occurred to her as her most able counsellor, and she determined by the first opportunity to consult with him upon the subject, certain of advice the most judicious from his experience and knowledge of the world. But though she rested upon him her serious expectations of assistance, another idea entered her mind not less pleasant, though less promising of utility. This was to mention her views to young Delvile. He was already, she knew, well informed of the distress of Mr. Belfield, and she hoped by openly asking his opinion to confirm to him her freedom from any engagement with that gentleman, and convince him at the same time by her application to himself that she was equally clear of any tie with the baronet. I do wonder why Cecilia is so keen that young Mr. Delvile should not suspect her of having any interest in either Mr. Belfield or Sir Robert. It's also quite an interesting portrayal of mental illness and depression, isn't it, in a period before psychoanalysis, and yet it shows that, I guess, humanity has never changed, and that people are people and suffer in remarkably similar ways, even if the ways this is expressed and the language used has perhaps changed a bit. And more of that to come, I suppose. Chapter 2. A sympathy. The next day Cecilia had appointed to spend in St. James's Square, and she knew by experience that in its course she should in all probability find some opportunity of speaking with Delvile alone. This accordingly happened, for in the evening Mrs. Delvile quitted the room for a few moments to answer a letter. Cecilia then, left with her son, said after a little hesitation, "Will you not think me very strange if I should take the liberty to consult you upon some business?" "I already think you very strange," answered he, "so strange that I know not any one who at all resembles you. But what is this consultation in which you will permit me to have a voice?" "You are acquainted, I believe, with the distress of Mr. Belfield." "I am, and I think his situation the most melancholy that can be imagined. I pity him with my whole soul, and nothing would give me greater joy than an opportunity of serving him." "He is indeed much to be compassionate," returned Cecilia, "and if something is not speedily done for him, I fear he will be utterly lost. The agitation of his mind baffles all the power of medicine. Until that is relieved, his health can never be restored. His spirits, probably always too high for his rank in life, now struggles against every attack of sickness and poverty, and in preference to yielding to his fate, and applying to his friends for their interest and assistance. I mean not to vindicate his obduracy. Indeed, I wish it were possible it could be surmounted. Indeed, I dread to think what may become of him, feeling at present nothing but wretchedness and pain, looking forward in future to nothing but ruin and despair." "There is no man," cried young Delvile with emotion, "who might not rather envy than pity sufferings which give rise to such compassion. Pecuniary assistance he will not accept," she continued, "and indeed his mind is superior to receiving consolation from such temporary relief. I wish him therefore to be put into some way of life by which his own talents, which have long enough amused the world, may at length become serviceable to himself. Do you think, sir, this is possible?" "How do I rejoice," cried Delvile, colouring with pleasure while he spoke, "in this flattering concurrence of our opinions! See, madam," taking from his pocket a letter, "how I have been this very morning occupied in endeavouring to procure for Mr. Belfield some employment by which his education might be rendered useful, and his parts redound to his own credit and advantage." He then broke the seal, and put into her hand a letter of a nobleman whose son was soon going abroad, strongly recommending Belfield to him in capacity as a tutor. A sympathy of sentiment so striking impressed them at the same moment with surprise and esteem. Delvile earnestly regarded her with eyes of speaking admiration, while the occasion of his notice rendered it too pleasant to distress her, and filled her with an inward satisfaction which brightened her whole countenance. She had only time, in a manner that strongly marked her approbation, to return the letter before Mrs. Delvile again made her appearance. I'm looking forward to seeing that scene on film, when the film of Cecilia eventually, well, not the film, the 10-part mini-series on the BBC eventually makes itself known. During the rest of the evening but little was said. Cecilia was not talkative, and young Delvile was so absent that 3 times his mother reminded him of an engagement to meet his father, who that night was expected at the Duke of Derwent's house in town, before he heard that she spoke to him, and 3 times more before, when he had heard, he obeyed. Cecilia, when she came back to Mr. Harrel's, found the house full of company. She went into the drawing room, but did not remain there long, and she was grave and thoughtful. She wished to be alone, and by the earliest opportunity stole away to her own apartment. Her mind was now occupied by new ideas, and her fancy was busied in the delineation of new prospects. She had been struck from her first meeting young Delvile with an involuntary admiration of his manners and conversation. She had found upon every succeeding interview something further to approve, and felt for him a rising partiality which made her always see him with pleasure, and never part from him without a wish to see him again. Yet as she was not of that inflammable nature which is always ready to take fire, as her passions were under the control of her reason, and she suffered not her affections to triumph over her principles, she started at her danger the moment she perceived it, and instantly determined to give no weak encouragement to a prepossession which neither time nor intimacy had justified. She denied herself the deluding satisfaction of dwelling upon the supposition of his worth, was unusually assiduous to occupy all her time, that her heart might have less leisure for imagination, and had she found that his character degenerated from the promise of his appearance, the well-regulated purity of her mind would soon have enabled her to have driven him wholly from her thoughts. Such was her situation when the circumstances of her affairs occasioned her becoming an inmate of his house, and here she grew less guarded, because less clear-sighted to the danger of negligence, for the frequency of their conversation allowed her little time to consider their effects. If at first she had been pleased with his deportment and elegance, upon intimacy she was charmed with his disposition and his behaviour. She found him manly, generous, open-hearted, and amiable, fond of literature, delighting in knowledge, kind in his temper, and spirited in his actions. Qualities such as these, when recommended by high birth, a striking figure, and polished manners, formed but a dangerous companion for a young woman, who, without the guard of any former prepossession, was so fervent an admirer of excellence as Cecilia. Her heart made no resistance, for the attack was too gentle and too gradual to alarm her vigilance, and therefore, though always sensible of the pleasure she received from his society, it was not till she returned to Portman Square, after having lived under the same roof with him for a fortnight, that she was conscious her happiness was no longer in her own power. Mr. Harrel's house, which had never pleased her, now became utterly disgustful. She was wearied and uncomfortable, yet willing to attribute her uneasiness to any other than the true cause. She fancied the house itself was changed, and that all its inhabitants and visitors were more than usually disagreeable. But this idle error was of short duration. The moment of self-conviction was at hand, and when Delvile presented her the letter he had written for Mr. Belfield, it flashed in her eyes. This detection of the altered state of her mind opened her views and her hopes a scene entirely new, for neither the exertion of the most active benevolence, nor the steady course of the most virtuous conduct, sufficed any longer to wholly engage her thoughts, or constitute her felicity. She had purposes that came nearer home, and cares that threatened to absorb in themselves that heart and those faculties which hitherto had only seemed animated for the service of others. Yet this loss of mental freedom gave her not much uneasiness, since the choice of her heart, though involuntary, was approved by her principles. Sure it was, Cecilia. That's how it works. And confirmed by her judgment. Good for you, Cecilia. Young Delvile's situation in life was just what she wished, more elevated than her own, yet not so exalted as to humble her with a sense of inferiority. His connections were honourable. His mother appeared to her the first of women. His character and disposition seemed formed to make her happy, and her own fortune was so large that to the state of his she was indifferent. Delighted with so flattering a union of inclination with propriety. Oh, Cecilia, there's still so much of this book to go. Delighted with so flattering a union of inclination with propriety, she now began to cherish the partiality she at first had repressed, and thinking the future destination of her life already settled, looked forward with grateful joy to the prospect of ending her days with the man she thought most worthy to be entrusted with the disposal of her fortune. She had not, indeed, any certainty that the regard of young Delvile was reciprocal, but she had every reason to believe he greatly admired her, and to suspect that his mistaken notion of her prior engagement, first with Mr. Belfield, and afterwards with Sir Robert Floyer, made him at present check these sentiments in her favour, which, when that error was removed, she hoped to see encouraged. Her purpose, therefore, was quietly to wait an explanation, which she rather wished retarded than forwarded, that her leisure and opportunity might be more for investigating his character and saving herself from repentance. I do think it's rather charming that she's thinking so much with her head and justifying her heart with all these rational suppositions and everything. It's really rather charming, isn't it? I don't think I necessarily read very well tonight. I'm a little bit tired, but it's a bit sweet, isn't it? What could possibly go wrong? Have a lovely evening.